Welcome to Beyond the Code, the podcast where industry experts and brilliant legal minds discuss the impact of new emerging technologies. I'm your host, Yitzi Hammer, a lawyer and tech enthusiast. Join us as we explore the legal, regulatory, and ethical issues surrounding AI, blockchain, and more. Get ready to go beyond the code and stay ahead of the game. Ilan, Alon, welcome to the podcast. This is my first time doing video, so I'm a little nervous here. It'll be much harder to edit with the video as well. But I feel like you've done this quite a few times. I listened to a few of your podcasts that you've recorded in the past, and you're an academic, so you guys get paid to speak and write.
Yes.
So I feel like this should flow pretty nicely. You know how people don't always know what you do, and then they have like a little bit of an understanding. Like my family doesn't really understand what I do. They know it has something to do with crypto and Bitcoin. So whenever something comes up, Bitcoin
and podcasting, and they have no idea how does one make a living like that.
So they don't really understand what I do. And then every time something comes up that's somehow related to like Bitcoin, they'll send me these like little snippets. So I met you a couple weeks ago at a crypto conference here in Israel. Hadn't really, I'm ashamed to say, heard of you beforehand, but then ever since we spoke, your name keeps like popping up everywhere. I'm seeing content that you wrote, and my wife, who has a general understanding of what I do, but isn't exactly sure, saw some article about Bitcoin, and she sent it to me. Like, here, check this out. This looks cool. And then I looked and I saw that you actually were quoted in the first line, some research you did recently. So so very serendipitous that you kept coming up in my feeding conversations.
It's like learning a new vocabulary, and then all of a sudden you start hearing the word all the time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So very opportune that I now have the opportunity to bring you up here on the pod. And there's a lot for us to talk about today. I, did a little bit of research into your research and found that I was fascinated with almost everything that you've spent the last number of years studying, globalization and tokenomics and blockchain, all things that I'm very passionate about and eager to hear more about. So, as is my custom, I do not introduce people. I hate those long monologues where people like read out a list of all your accolades. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about you and your research and where you're from and who you are, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, so I have a very long and illustrious career, and it's been in different parts of the world. So maybe you could just leave a LinkedIn link to in the bottom of the podcast so people could see my entire profile and what I've done. But just to summarize it in maybe 1 minute, I was born in Israel. I left at the age of 14 and I came back at the age of 50 after charting the world, China, America, Europe. And now I'm back, and I'm the Dean of the College of Management in Rishon in the School of Economics, and a professor of international economics, and a researcher and an advisor to several companies.
And where is your main focus now, on teaching or on researching?
My main focus at the moment is administration because I'm a dean, but generally speaking, I would say that my job split between teaching and research before, and that's inside the university, but outside the university, I've been quite involved in consulting and advisory.
And your main avenues of research?
So I've researched international economics. My PhD is in international economics and international economic order. And I've also had a chance to research global governance. And then I also looked at the more micro level, at the multinational enterprise. And I looked also at cryptocurrencies since around the time of COVID. I've started to learn about cryptocurrencies and gotten into that as well.
And how do those fit in? Like, how does cryptocurrency affect globalization and global economics?
First of all, I think that globalization has changed quite significantly since COVID. And if globalization means, the movement of people, the movement of money, and the movement of goods and services, then I would say that globalization has gone through a number of variations over the years. In the past, people could move from country to country because the nation state wasn't around, but yet, goods and services and money wasn't moving, but people were moving. And then later on, since really the entry of China to the World Trade Organization, we saw the dominance of China as a trading country, which flooded the world with exports and changed the way globalization looks. Really, China led globalization, I would say, with Americans buying Chinese goods and the Chinese buying all the goods to manufacture other goods, investing in their economy. I think that time has also gone away. And now we live in a world where international politics will reorganize international economic structures. And I think crypto is in the overall scheme of things, is part of the decentralization of the world economic system. And if you think about decentralization as a whole, really, democracies in a way is decentralization of governance, right? Moving it from one person, rule of man, to rule of law, rule of people. So the world now, the globalization is changing to probably more and more to be based on friend shoring, friend trading. And I think there is a new
What does that mean?
A new type of. I will get to it in a second. There's also. Let me just finish this thought. There's a new type of globalization, and that is, I would say, the sovereign individual. So the unit of analysis has moved from the global, where international institutions rule, like the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, and the United Nations, and The Hague, and all these international institutions, all the way past the national level to the individual level. And I think this idea of the sovereign individual has started to really interest me. And it's really tied in very closely with Bitcoin and crypto, because Bitcoin being a digital global asset, it really can jive well with what we call the sovereign individual.
So friend shoring was something that you mentioned. What could you elaborate on that exactly?
So in the past, in the 1990s and early into 2000, I was involved in a lot of consultancy, mostly for American companies and Chinese companies that are interested in internationalizing. And for many of the American companies, what I tried to do is find more efficient ways to manufacture. And you saw like an exodus of manufacturing from the United States into China. And that trade deficit was really that the United States has with China was really as a result of American multinationals moving their production to China. And this has worked for some time because Americans could buy cheap products and in return sell them T-bonds, treasury bills, right? American debt. So it seemed like a good deal until the political interests of China and the United States started to diverge. And at that point, the logic of offshoring to enemies, such as China, became flawed. And now the interest is, by the way, not only for the United States, but for countries like Israel. We saw that after October 7th, that we have some countries that are less friendly and could hurt us economically. For example, Turkey, for example, Norway, and they in turn, therefore, affect the way we invest in the future and who we should deal with in the future. So this is the idea of friend shoring, right? Investing in friendly countries, and friend trading, which is really trading with your friends rather than with your enemies. And I think America is also going through this process, and that's why we're seeing now the Biden administration put a very high tariffs on a lot of different types of Chinese imports, as well as Chinese technology companies like TikTok, for example.
And so where does Bitcoin fit in? Is it
Bitcoin
more like...
is a new asset type. Some think of it as a new monetary system.
But when I say Bitcoin, I mean cryptocurrencies in general. It doesn't have to necessarily be Bitcoin. And I'm curious.
But Bitcoin is still the elephant in the room, right? I mean, even if we take all the crypto, the tens of thousands of different cryptocurrencies that exist, at the end of the day, Bitcoin is more than 50%. So Bitcoin is the gorilla in the room or the elephant in the room, and everything else is just ecosystems similar to Bitcoin, but do something different. The ones that will survive will essentially solve a particular problem. Bitcoin solves only one problem, really, which is the problem that money has is a storage of value, right? That's the main problem. As a transactional unit, it's not as good as fiat money. It doesn't have the infrastructure. You cannot go and buy your coffee. But each one of these cryptocurrencies, you could think about them as an ecosystem, as a self-sustained economy, trading with other crypto ecosystem, which also represent a sense of self-sustained economy. If I could explain it in more detail, when we do economic analysis, we often analyze economic, social, political, and technological forces.
Mm-hmm.
And these are what we call kind of the macro environmental forces impacting individuals, impacting multinational companies. Well, in fact, each one of these cryptocurrencies is a sort of a country without borders, right? It's a country with rules. It's an ecosystem that has rules of engagement, right? Protocol,
Mm-hmm.
a way to transfer value. And it even has not only the code and rules, right? Where the code is the law, it even has a culture, right? You consider that the Bitcoin maximalists, they're a very specific type of a culture type, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And they're different from the Ethereum maximalists, in their thinking, in their behavior. And you can see that when you go to the conferences that are Bitcoin dominated versus Ethereum dominated. You can see that each one of these, and then you have the XRP army, and they even call it an army, right? So you literally have societies that cross traditional borders and are able to share a culture and share a monetary unit. So, in a way, if you go to a Bitcoin conference in Israel, and if you go to a Bitcoin conference in the United States or even in Singapore, you might have a lot more in common with the people, if you're a Bitcoiner, with the people in that conference than you have with people in your own society, your neighbors in your own city. So, in a sense, we're developing a new economic organization that allows segments of society to share values to also share money or transactions or economic ecosystem.
You see that globalization on the regulatory side as well. Whereas in Web 2, let's call it, you might have had GDPR regulations that were very easy to understand who they related to, who needed to comply with GDPR. Basically, anybody who was processing data of European persons. Whereas in blockchain related technologies, it's much harder to pinpoint your exposure from a regulatory perspective. And so you're exposed to multiple regulatory frameworks that adds another level of complexity, both in terms of where and how you should structure your company, and how do you actually remain compliant when you have much less control as to the breadth of your product's reach. So
from a supranational point of view, there is no international law, right? I mean,
I'm not talking about international law. I'm talking about
the world, right.
Local laws that
I'm going to drill down in a moment.
All right.
So from an international standpoint, we live in a world of energy. That is, the nation states is still the primary modus of organization for regulation and for control of individuals. So at the end, we are all individuals living in a country or a set of countries, most of us a single country. And we are subjected to the laws of that country. In addition, we are also subjected to a bunch of American laws because America is extraterritorial with the application of its laws, both to its own citizens and to the citizenry of others. For example, by the application of sanctions. So at the end of the day, if the United States is against anything, it will have a very hard time, let's say, thriving in our world, because the United States is still the largest economy and maybe the engine for most economic activities in the world. So from that standpoint, let's just say that America sets the tone, including for the world of crypto. And unfortunately, the Biden administration has been a bit more hostile. But now, given the upcoming elections and both Trump and Kennedy, let's say, more than support for the crypto community, because they want the crypto community to vote for them, you can see the Biden administration is also turning a little bit more positive, including Gary Gensler, the head of the SEC. You could see they recently approved the ETF by Ethereum. So it seems as though the United States is shifting towards more permissiveness in the field of crypto. But really, if you think about crypto, what's the most exciting thing about it is that it creates the ability for people to be sovereign individuals. If you think about like most of our pension plans around the world, like in Israel, for example, a lot of our pension plans, the government forces us to buy government bonds. Government bonds, generally speaking, don't hold purchasing value over time. In fact, they can hardly even keep up with inflation, let alone give us the opportunity to purchase more. So if you think about like when we work and we save money, we're basically saving our labor energy today so we could buy labor energy from somebody else in the future. Okay, this is basically what we're doing. It's a preservation of energy, right? We're preserving energy. And when you're investing in fiat and the fiat loses value significantly, all of a sudden you're dependent on the state generosity to finance your old age, your pension. And the sovereign individual doesn't want to depend on any nation state, on any government for its well-being. He or she wants to have maybe multiple currencies, cryptocurrencies, multiple citizenships, and maybe the ability to control the fate and future of his or her own family without or let's say, despite the control of the government. So these type of individuals, they tend to be libertarians. They tend to be something between Peter Thiel and Michael Saylor, right? The combination of this kind, and they tend to be, by the way, wealthier.
So I wonder. You mentioned America's like ultimate power on the in the global scale. I wonder if elections aside, its vendetta over the last few years against crypto will ultimately segregate it from international finance, and maybe they'll have to pay a price for their.
No, I don't think it will be segregated, and I also don't think it's going to be replace the current economic system as many Bitcoin maximalists think will happen quickly. I don't think it will happen quickly at all. I think it will live side by side in symbiosis. I think that some governments will choose to adopt it and endorse it, like El Salvador, maybe Argentina is going in that direction. And other governments that don't like decentralization and don't like to lose control, like China and Cuba and North Korea, will ban it.
CBDCs.
And the rest of the countries, like Israel and Europe, will find the middle ground, right, where it will be allowed for investors as part of economic freedom. By the way, this is what my research showed. So basically, it's an expression of economic freedom, right? And if you want to take it even further, it's an expression of the freedom of speech, right? Because code is speech. So in a sense,
code is speech, code is law, speech is law.
Yeah, in a way, yeah.
Yeah. But to date, I'm just going back to my previous question. To date, anybody who wants to operate within the crypto sphere basically needs to block American consumers, because it's almost impossible to remain compliant with the SEC's regulatory regime, which has been.
I tend to disagree. I think the United States is the biggest host for this industry at the moment. Still,
it would be
despite despite Gary Gensler's objections and some senators and there's some, especially on the left side of the aisle, I would say that still most of the activity, even Binance, could not really survive without the way it does without the United States. And then we have, of course, all the major exchanges, a lot of the innovation, XRP. It's still all in in the United States. So you're right that there's places that are more permissive.
It's
But at
not
the end of the
it's
day,
not a
the
matter of
economic action.
permissive. It's a matter of just like regulatory transparency. The SEC has been notoriously vague as to how you can be compliant as a crypto exchange or a
The
cryptocurrency.
regulatory burden is certainly high, but you cannot avoid the United States if you want to be a global player. Even Binance, right?
Right,
Whose
but it's
CEO
not
just went to
sustainable.
jail, right? Because
It's
it cannot operate without America, and it understood it, and that's why he's willing to go
but
to jail.
Binance and Coinbase and Ripple aside, most people can't afford hundreds of $1 million in litigation just to get to a point where the SEC says, "Okay, fine, we'll let you go." So in that sense, it's not sustainable to be operational in U.S.
Isn't
markets.
Ethereum in the United States?
But
Aren't
Ethereum
more
is not a project that you could pinpoint one person and say like
really?
it's
I think
I
we can. I think it's
just
Vitalik Buterin. And
it
by the
was
way, I wanted to mention one more thing. At the end of the day, somebody's got jurisdiction. Even if it's an open protocol, it's on a server. The server is owned by someone.
it's not on a
You can
server.
pinpoint.
It's not on a
It's
server.
it
You
it's
have multiple nodes across multiple jurisdictions. Like you can't. I mean, theoretically, and the SEC tried to do this with Ethereum. You could say, okay, the majority of the validators are in the U.S. and therefore the U.S. has jurisdiction. But you can't do that in every instance, and even that, it's a far stretch.
that's right. But in most crypto projects, they're not really fully decentralized. Let's say definitely not as decentralized as Bitcoin.
For
And
sure.
as a result, there's always a foundation behind it. There's always, where most of the data is kind of stored in some limited number. So I think if you want to take down people, even open protocols that, we have cases, we have actually real cases that
Mm-hmm.
the inventor went to jail, or, somebody's going to pay the price. And in the case of Bitcoin, it's maybe, the ship has left the dock, so to speak, and now it's safe. But again, I tell Bitcoin maximalists, if the United States made Bitcoin illegal, it would lose 50, 60% of its value overnight. Overnight. If the United States said it's illegal to own and hold Bitcoin, for whatever reasons, Bitcoin will suffer tremendously.
But ultimately, the United States would also suffer from
true.
something like that.
And that's true, by the way. I'm a big libertarian, and I believe that if the United States owned any kind of freedoms, by the way, not only economic freedoms, which is, I consider ownership of crypto as a sort of economic freedom, but I've also shown that on political and civil and even religious freedom, there's an impact on quality of life and the GDP per capita. I even have a paper that was published in the Cato Journal that shows that religious freedom is associated with rich countries, right? So any kind of freedom, including especially economic freedom, is correlated with wealth. So if your country wants to be wealthy, it's probably worthwhile to be a free country and a democratic country, and one that espouses economic freedom. People use China as the counter example. They say, well, look at China. I say, yeah, look at China. What is the GDP per capita in China? What is the level of corruption of China? What is the level of pollution in China? Why does every Chinese person want to immigrate to the US or Australia or UK or other rich developed countries? What is the level of freedom of China? Can you speak up your mind in China? Can you criticize the government in China? Can you own Bitcoin in China? The answer is no to all of this. And therefore, China is not really the new United States, right? It's not the new superpower, because a superpower needs to have soft power, right? The biggest power of a superpower is soft power. The biggest power of the US dollar is the belief that it's a stable and a currency that is well governed. And that's why it's become basically the dollar is an international currency that is used in all the central banks around the world, including in Israel, by the way. Most of our reserves are in dollars. So in a sense, the United States still has the opportunity to tax the entire world by printing money, something that no other country has, which gives it superpower status.
Okay, and how do you think governance fits into that? Like we spoke about the economic features of Bitcoin, but the other aspects of blockchain, the governance aspect.
So I'm a big fan of governance, and
Hmm.
as an economist, I actually think that long term, it's the only and the single most important thing for economic growth is governance at the country level and at the firm level as well. So if we look at the country level, there is the World Governance Report, which looks at different dimensions of governance.
Hmm.
And that includes the effectiveness of government, corruption, control over violence, political risks, political and economic risks. So these type of things, and of course, voice and accountability, which is the level of democracy in the country. So all these factors basically create the governance environment. And for any country to develop over time in a sustainable way, you need to have low corruption, effective government, transparency, checks and balances, lack of political risk, lack of violence, right? Societies cannot prosper without these basic foundational things. Now, again, you could point out to China and say, well, look at China. China doesn't have these things. And what I will argue, and what I have argued, and got me banned in China, is that China doesn't have the ability to sustain economic growth because of those things. And what innovation came out of China? The only thing they're good at is imitating or squandering innovation. They're not good at creating their own innovation, technologies, basic science. There's almost nothing, which is really a shame considering the country is graduating millions of engineers and PhDs, and it's not for the lack of human resources or talent, it's just bad governance. So the same thing goes for a company. If we go to the company level, a company that doesn't have checks and balances, that doesn't have a good governance, that doesn't have a good treasury function, that doesn't have good control, like FTX, for example, will ultimately fail. Like Enron is another example, will ultimately go bankrupt. So good companies that have good governance, that have a board of trustees that supervises the CEO, that the CEO cannot exert too much power, that there's checks and balances, that there is the minority shareholders are protected, right? That's good governance at the company level. And that too, in my opinion, is highly related to ability of companies to sustain themselves over time.
Okay, I want to on that point. I want to ask you what your thoughts are on DAOs, because a DAO could go rogue in that sense, despite the fact that it, theoretically provides equal governance to everybody. But it might be. But before that, you kind of just dropped on the table that you were banned in China for saying some of these things. How did that come about?
So I have a very long podcast with Ilan Weisberg on Globes on China. You might want to listen to it.
In Hebrew
Because
or
it's really
English?
it's in Hebrew.
Okay.
Long story short, I wrote a few pieces
Were you
on
living in
the
China?
theft of. I spent significant amount of time in
Hmm.
China. I speak Mandarin Chinese, and
Wow. Cool.
and I really have pretty good understanding. I wrote several books. As I mentioned, I help Chinese companies. I help American companies. So I was involved in China quite a lot. And at some point, let's just say I was less welcome because of some things that I've written about China that were showing the king is naked.
Okay. That's the short story. I want the long one.
Yeah,
um,
the long one is longer.
it's long.
An entire podcast just on that.
Okay, fair enough. We'll have to reschedule. Okay, so what are your thoughts on governance vis-a-vis DAOs?
So, by the way, not just DAOs, but let's just say all cryptocurrencies have certain governance systems. Okay, Bitcoin included. That includes, the tokenomics. That includes who gets compensated for what,
So not DAOs, but any
how the
protocol.
token gets how the token gets distributed. What are the incentive system in society? This is sort of
Hmm.
called this closed ecosystem, right? That develops it. So DAOs are even more complicated than just any old crypto.
Hmm.
But I would say that that's an area that needs to be researched because we know very, very little about how the governance of a DAO affects its sustainability. A, we don't have a lot of sustainability to speak of, right? Because most of these DAOs are relatively young. And B, we certainly don't know anything about how the rulemaking in a DAO impacts sustainability. I think it's a fantastic doctorate that somebody could do on it, and probably the data is there. So probably there, you could actually learn some things already from what's available.
Right, so not so much DAOs as just any decentralized protocol or anything that presumes to be decentralized and gives over the keys, so to speak, to to its members.
As I said, DAOs, companies, and countries, governance matters. Governance matters. The rules that you make and the way you manage internal units of the system manage to its ability to survive, right? It's important. So DAOs even more so because they're decentralized, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's no one to point responsibility and say it's your fault, right? Because in groups nobody takes fault. By the way, have you noticed that when groups make mistakes, nobody takes fault. Nobody says it's my fault. Because it's a group decision. By the way, that's why governments like to make decisions in committees, also companies. This way you can't really blame anyone. So in a way, you lose accountability. You lose accountability when there's not a centralization, when decentralization somehow can cause accountability to go away. Now, what is the right balance between accountability and control, and the incentive systems that you put in place, and who do you incentivize, and how much of your resources you spend on different stakeholders? All that matters, but we know very little about how that affects sustainability.
Another research topic for a PhD.
Yeah, for sure. I think I would love to recruit a PhD student. If somebody is listening and wants to do a PhD, contact me.
I'm not there yet, but it does sound like a fascinating topic. Definitely something that I would want to jump deeper into. So tell me a little bit about your research currently. Like, what are you working on?
So I've worked now on a number of projects with my PhD students mostly. I have a very interesting research project on the decentralized finance with a PhD student. I have one on Web3 and marketing in the Web3. So I'm interested in, of course, I'm still interested in international business and the multinational enterprise. I'm also interested at the governance level, at countries, and what happens at the country level. So I have some research that is ongoing on China, for example. And I look now at how Chinese multinationals are expanding to other countries and the impact that has on China and those countries.
So I think this is something that we might have discussed when we met last time, but the Web3 marketing. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I feel like that's one area of Web3 that nobody's really managed to crack yet. What are you researching exactly?
Well, there's several companies that are already doing business in this area. There's an Israeli company called Adaptability that is dealing with this specifically, and it's able to link wallets to Twitter accounts and develop. Be happy to introduce you to Asaf, who's the CEO.
Please.
He was a guest lecturer in my class, so I learned more about that. But the truth is that Web3 provides all the opportunities that Web2 provided, and now the question is, how to tackle it. The big difference, of course, between Web2 and Web3, for those who don't know it, is who owns the data. In Web3, each individual owns his or her data, right, and can buy and sell their own data and other people's data directly. So they don't need to have a company like Google or Facebook or another central entity that will allow them to make these connections, right? They can deal with the rest of the world directly. They can own their identity and the assets that they have that are related to that identity. And this provides a whole new set of internet, okay, including the internet of money, which includes Bitcoin.
It's so interesting that you chose to define Web3 as that. I never thought about that as the distinction between Web2 and Web3, ownership of data, but it certainly is like a very prominent feature of Web3. I would have
How
thought
would you? What differentiates it for you in your mind?
so I mean, I just see the way that we interact with data and the decisions we make, especially vis-a-vis wallet connectivity, as giving you a little bit more, I guess, ownership of the process, but less from a data perspective. As somebody who came from like the world of privacy, and as somebody who's a bit of like a privacy freak, it adds like a level of complexity to privacy laws generally because of the immutable aspect of blockchain. So to the extent that you do have this data that you decide to put on chain, it's basically like what's on chain is forever in a sense. So I wouldn't think of
It strikes a balance between privacy and transparency, which is very different, right? Because it's semi-private, but yet transparent, right?
it's
Because you're represented
wholly
by a
transparent.
wallet, right?
Yeah,
But now there's also ways to connect the wallet to a real identity, right? And I think ultimately the difference between, if you bought a website from some service here, you just allow your wallet becomes you, right? You can become an identity that is unique, that takes its own decisions about what is the privacy about? Privacy of data,
but you're
right? I
not.
mean, at the end of the day, that's what you're trading. You're trading data, right?
And yet the question of what is you and who are you is really is needs to be redefined as well, because if you are your wallet address, and if I ask you who owns a wallet, I mean, I think the one who owns the wallet is the one who has access to the funds that are inside or whatever other assets are inside, and that's determined by who holds its private keys, which raise other questions. So theoretically, both of us could own the wallet or have access to the wallet, and then it's a question of like, whose data is it? Is it mine? Is it yours? Who am I? So there are a lot of these things that are so easy to answer in Web 2. We still haven't found answers for them in Web 3, and especially in the world of privacy. And in other words, like, how do we process data, and how do we view data, and what is personal data, and when does it become subject to traditional regulations, is something that we haven't yet tackled.
It's all going to be subject to judicial regulation again, because at the end of the day, we live in a nation state
right
that has laws, right? And we have to be subjected to these laws unless we're willing to be criminals. And this is an argument that I had with Ben Samocha, and I said, well, what if the government said that it's illegal? Say, I'll leave the country. Well, what if America said it? Then all the governments in the world will follow, right? And then you could still, just like people own gold, right? Like during the period of prohibition, they were just illegal, and a lot of people don't want to be criminals, right? They want to be legal and not criminal. So I think, by the way, a lot of our assumptions about Bitcoin were wrong. I think we thought that it would be inflation insurance. We thought that it will be inclusivity for poor people, banking for poor people. Maybe it's true
it's not all of those
part
things.
of it.
It's
exactly, it's not. At the end
I
of
was
the
under the
day,
impression that it is.
that's the thing. It's sold as that, but at the end, who owns it? Wall Street. Wall Street is the biggest beneficiary. At the end, who owns all this Bitcoin in the world? It's the richest people in the world. It's Michael Saylor, and it's Peter Thiel, and it's GBTC, and it's Fidelity, and BlackRock. And at the end, the concentration of capital continued in the form of Bitcoin instead of in the form of fiat or the gold or real estate. Capital get concentrated at the end of the day to just a small number of rich countries and rich people within them.
Wow, what a depressing note.
It's not depressing if you're the one who kind of realize that this is going to happen and you can benefit from it because the asset will go up in value. But I would say that probably
then it's a
there's
speculative
concentration
asset
of
like
wealth
any
in
other.
Bitcoin. Huh?
Then it's a speculative asset like any other. It
Correct.
loses its unique aspects. It's
exactly it. It's a speculative asset that mirrors very closely tech stocks when you look at the movements.
Yeah.
And it doesn't happen like, actually, I checked it empirically. It doesn't correlate with inflation the way we think. In fact, inflation is terrible for it, just like all the other assets,
Wow.
financial assets.
Oh
You know,
man, you really
and in
freaking me out
fact, the
here.
countries that have the highest adoption are countries that have low interest rates, low inflation, and a well-developed financial system.
I'm very scared about where our local economy is going in light of
But by
this
the way, the
prolonged war.
concentration of capital is always been the case, right? I mean, it's not. This is not new. Lenin wrote about this. Marx wrote about this, right? I mean, even free market economists talk about the concentration of capital, the creation of monopolies, and then the breakup of monopolies. Schumpeter talks about how we build monopolies, and the entrepreneurs break up the old monopolies, and then there's new monopolies that develop, and that's the cycle of economic development. In other words, there's nothing wrong with it. It's the natural process
No,
of economic
I didn't say
development.
there's anything wrong with it. You just caught me off guard. Like I said, I'm very concerned about the direction of our economy in light of this prolonged war, and my solution to it all was I'm going to buy more Bitcoin. But I guess
But
you're
that's
saying
fine,
that that's not.
and that's a good solution for you as a sovereign individual, right? That's what, again, what I'm saying. I think we all need to be independent and to make sure that we can protect ourselves and our families in case of crisis. And and what the October 7th has taught us, that even for the basic security, we can count on the government, right? Let alone long-term financial security, right? We've seen many governments fail their citizenry because when the pension time came, all of a sudden the budgets were out of money. I think Israel in general is in good shape. If we continue with the market economy, we have a lot of entrepreneurial talent. We have good technologies. We have a decent education system. We have relatively
It
low
depends who you ask.
unemployment. We work really hard. We work 6 days a week. We work a lot of hours. I think the Israeli worker is a good worker. I think we're clever. We as a nation. I think the fact that we have dealt with so many obstacles and still win is a testament to what a good athletes we are, right? I mean, like, so if you think about an athlete that is competing with weights on his ankles, then just take the weights off and see what happens, right? And that, by the way, that's what happens to many Israelis when they go overseas, right? They thrive in New York and in Berlin and in different places because they're such good economic athletes, if you will. They're so good at what they do. They were able to deal with the Israeli economic environment, which is very tough. Having said that, the government has a role, and the role is not to overspend, to make sure that we spend the money in the right place, to make sure that they provide security, a rule of law, a stable environment, a deficit that is not out of control. And unfortunately, in Israel, we have coalition governments where minority members can extract a huge amount of resources, and that creates economic inefficiencies.
I was hoping that you were going to end like 2 sentences ago with that like very optimistic note about Israelis' ability to succeed over time, but then you got back into got back into the
No, but look,
downward spiral.
but it's the same thing about the United States. People are always crying about the United States, how bad it is. And you know what? The United States is a very resilient economy. It's gone through massive crises. I think China underestimated the U.S. I think China thought in 2008, when I was there, that U.S. time is finished, right? The empire is gone, and China is going to show on the rest of the world. Look what happens to China now. They're experiencing this very same financial crisis and a real estate crisis, but even on a grander scale, much grander scale, because they don't have this economy that can change because it's market driven. They have a government driven economy, and governments move slowly and move badly. So I'm not very optimistic. And in fact, if I had to, I would short the Chinese stock market, not long the Chinese stock market. If I had to think about the Israeli market, I long the Israeli market. I believe that the Israeli entrepreneur will overcome the problems, will learn from it, will become stronger and smarter as a result. So yes, we go through these temporary problems, and then we can change leadership, both in the United States and in Israel, and we can be reborn and change things. And that's what I'm hoping that we'll do.
That's the note I want to end on. I like that. Obviously, not financial advice, but short China and long and go long in Israel.
But I agree with you in terms of the sovereign individual. I think that Bitcoin should be in any portfolio. The question is, what percentage, right? Like how much exposure do you want? I personally want to have a very high exposure, but some people, even a 5% exposure can boost your alpha. That is your returns and even decrease your risk. It's ironic, right? Because people think, well, how can I decrease risk if I buy such a risky asset? And the answer is it doesn't correlate with traditional assets like the stock market. So it reduces the fluctuation in your portfolio.
So again, buy Bitcoin, but not financial advice. Ilan, thank you. This was really, really, really interesting and engaging for me.
Pleasure.
What note could we leave our listeners with? Number one, like what's the best way to connect with you, to follow you, to read your research, to listen to you? Oh, you lost an AirPod there.
Yeah. Let me do that. You'll need to edit it afterwards.
Go ahead.
So the best place to contact me, as I mentioned in the beginning, is probably through LinkedIn, and just join my network. I think if I want to leave on a positive note, I think we should all try to be sovereign individuals. Sovereignty or independence is important for countries. By the way, it's the opposite of globalization, right? Going back to our initial conversation. With globalization, many countries after World War II were willing to give up their sovereignty, right? They were willing to give up their ability for rulemaking to subjugate the international institutions to make those decisions for them. For example, the WHO, for example, the World Trade Organization, and there are mechanisms, IMF, International Monetary Fund, there are mechanisms for dealing with one another. I think the trend is up. I think we're going back to nationalization, sovereignty as a primary survival instinct of the nation state. And I think we can also do it at the individual level, right? How can we be independent so that we don't have the fate, we don't have to be subjected to the fate of the country we live in only, right? That we can control our own future, that we can limit the influence the government has on us.
I like that. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Great. You're welcome. It was good talking to you, too.
We got to do this again so I can get the whole China story with the ban. So I'm gonna plug you in. I'm gonna plug you in for a continuation.
Sounds good.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Code. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe, share with your friends, and to tune in again next week for more fun and insightful conversation.